Welcome everyone to our very last ACE Committee presentation on the topic of cultural appropriation versus appreciation. Let's start off by breaking down these terms. What is culture? According to Oxford Dictionary, culture is the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. It's usually used in reference to nationality, race, or ethnicity. For example, Canadian culture, Indigenous culture, and Black culture are all distinct, yet perhaps at times overlapping groups. What is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, etc. of one people or society by members of another and typically more dominant people or society. So, again, taking this idea of culture, when you appropriate someone else's culture, you are taking it in a disrespectful or offensive way. So let's learn a bit more about what this means by listening to this first video.
What is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is when someone intentionally or unintentionally takes and exploits part of a culture they don't belong to. It can mean using ideas or customs or clothing inappropriately and without permission. In the United States, it typically occurs across race, where the dominant white culture inappropriately and offensively uses the cultures of Black people, Indigenous people, or people of color. Cultural appropriation does not respect or honor the culture. Cultural appropriation harms the culture and the people who claim it as their way of life.
So, to go even further into this idea, here are some examples of what cultural appropriation can look like in daily life. One very common one is to profit off of someone else's culture. An example of this is to sell clothes or other items with cultural designs on it without giving credit or compensation to people of that culture. We see this a lot. One big example is in Canadian souvenir shops. You may see dream catchers or other items that are associated with Indigenous culture that are just knockoffs of these cultural items and were not created by or paid for to the actual people of that culture. So when you are profiting off of someone else's culture and you do not acknowledge them or give them some form of payment for that, that's an example of cultural appropriation. Another common one is dressing up in the clothes or traditional outfits of someone else's culture for a costume event. Of course, the biggest example of this is Halloween. Unfortunately, it is still quite common for people to dress up as another racial identity for Halloween or other costume events. In costume shops, you will often see pre-made outfits for a Pocahontas princess or a Mexican cowboy, etc., which are, of course, very offensive. Another similar example is using sacred cultural symbols as fashion accessories. So, similar to Halloween, many people will also appropriate other fashion or other symbols as their outfits and their accessories for things like parties, raves, and music festivals are especially notorious for that. At places like Coachella and other festivals, it is very common to see people wearing Indigenous headdresses who are not Indigenous. Another example is to name a sports team after a group of racialized people. We can think of the Redskins, the Blackhawks, the Indians, all sports teams that took indigenous names and sometimes derogatory names for indigenous people and used them to identify their sports teams. And then lastly, we have crediting white people with creating or discovering something that is historically from another culture. So this stems all the way back to imperialism and colonization when the British empires and other European empires would move into other countries and regions and claim it for their own. And we still see elements of that today, from fashion to media to academic ideas of white people taking the ideas of people of color and claiming them as their own. Even if it's unintentional and by accident, it can still be harmful. And here we have our next video.
Tansei, bonjour, and how you doing? It's me, Rosanna Deerchild, host of Unreserved and your favorite cousin. Well, it's that time of year. Leaves are falling, the weather is cooling, and pumpkins are everywhere, from front yards to coffee cups. Now, I love a good pumpkin spice latte as much as the next person, or not. But come October, I always feel a little uneasy and more than a little queasy as to what is waiting for me out there. No, I'm not talking about Halloween per se. I'm talking about those horrifying costumes. You've seen them. Princess Pocahontas, Reservation Royalty, the brave Cherokee warrior with the plastic tomahawk and all its ilk. Yes, you too can be indigeni for the low, low price of just $29.99, oppression not included. Now, as Indigenous peoples, we come from beautiful cultural backgrounds many non-Indigenous people admire. I mean, I get it. The beauty in our culture and traditions fascinates you. There's just one problem. We are not costumes. Let me explain the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. What exactly is cultural appropriation? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Cultural appropriation is when someone takes elements from a culture not their own and remakes and reduces it into a meaningless pop cultural item. I'm thinking hipster headdresses, tribal face paint, and yes, those so-called Halloween harmless fun costumes. It's not harmless fun. That headdress, for example, traditionally, a headdress is gifted to leaders who have earned the right to wear one. Receiving a headdress involves ceremonies and protocols and is considered to be a sacred item, and it takes many years for these leaders to earn one. And that Pocahontas and sexy buck outfit, well, they play off dangerous stereotypes of Indigenous people as mythical and historical creatures that once, but no more, roam this great land.
Like the Seminole, Navajo, Kickapoo, like the Cherokee, I'm an Indian too.
Cultural appropriation can be harmful because it is an extension of centuries of racism, genocide, and oppression. Cultural appropriation treats marginalized cultures as free for the taking. So not cool. On the other hand, cultural appreciation truly honors our nation's arts and cultures. When you appreciate, you take the time to learn and interact, to gain understanding of a culture or cultures different from your own. It is a cultural exchange based in mutual respect. The key is consent and participation. If it is about us, then it must include us. A few ways you can truly appreciate Indigenous peoples and culture. Know our history. I don't mean just yours or mine, I mean our collective history. So we truly understand where we come from and where we come together. Remember, appreciation good, appropriation bad. And this year, let's all have a happy Halloween.
All right, so now we have come to our first discussion question of the session. After watching these videos, why do you think it is inappropriate to wear someone's culture as a costume?
It's strange because you're looking at it, you can't quite turn away, no matter how disgusted. You can't quite believe what you're seeing.
I'm not about to deny anybody's pain upon seeing these images, because of course they're disturbing.
Certainly, it's difficult to face things that are ugly in our history. But denial is worse.
Many, if not most, of the performers we think of as the very backbone of the film industry performed in blackface or approximate to it.
I mean, you can see Bing Crosby in Holiday Inn. You can see Fred Astaire in Swing Time. There are all sorts, even poor little Shirley Temple.
Who told you to put that black on?
In just about every case, putting on the blackface becomes this way that white characters get to actually show their emotional selves. Characters bond, they get in touch with their feelings, and that's a fascinating dimension of what Black representation is doing there.
Some people think that Hollywood created these stereotypes. Hollywood did not create them.
Hollywood has been a huge mechanism for perpetuating these kinds of performative traditions that date back to blackface minstrelsy.
We can't say conclusively how it got started or when, but we do know a pivotal time. And this was in the 1830s. There was an entertainer, Thomas Rice, who did a song called Jump Jim Crow,
in which he was doing a caricature of what he said was an authentic performance by a Black stableman. He had seen this guy who worked around the horses.
And who did this dance, and he watched him and in essence sort of lifted it and then went in blackface, performed it very successfully. And it begins to spread, and eventually we get the minstrel troops.
Minstrelsy was the primary mechanism for white people to see anything related to Black culture.
And what the minstrel shows were doing was to take any fear a white audience may have had about African Americans, to take that fear out of it. That these childlike figures, they can't hurt you. They can't supervise themselves. They're in need of supervision. And so this power balance where whites are in control of these untutored darky figures, it's justified.
It replicated what people romanticized about life in the antebellum South, because it was presenting a picture of slavery times in which slaves were happy, that they're dancing and singing and happy to be serving their masters, which is, of course, a grotesque misrepresentation of what the slave system actually was for not just the people who were enslaved, but the people who were the slave masters.
What I think is sometimes harder to see is the ways in which blackface performance afforded a certain kind of curiosity and fascination with African American life.
And so minstrel shows became an extremely popular American entertainment. In fact, people say that blackface minstrelsy is really the first American art form.
And it produced a sense of the national culture, and the national culture as predominantly African American. The massive irony of all this is that fundamental African Americanness
I am proud to present our star
is being produced by white men in blackface.
Hollywood certainly did not invent blackface. What the cinema does, though, is perpetuates and circulates these images far beyond what live theatrical performance could do.
What changes Hollywood is that sound comes in 1927. And ironically, who brings it in? The minstrel man himself, Al Jolson, with a movie called The Jazz Singer.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Toot-toot-toot-tee, goodbye. Toot-toot-toot-tee, don't cry.
Jolson was known for his incredibly gregarious, buoyant, sort of energetic performance style. So when you watch him in The Jazz Singer, just the way that he kind of dances around as he's singing, he really gives us a sense of what must have been so appealing to audiences about blackface minstrelsy.
Don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Goodbye, Tootsie, goodbye. Mammy.
He has 2 blackface numbers. He can do songs without being in blackface, but he can't leave it behind.
The sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best.
And the audience for Al Jolson doesn't, I'm talking the white audience, doesn't want him to leave it behind.
Yes, I'm going up to heaven.
Wonderbar has one of the most exaggerated, extended blackface musical performances in classic film. And Al Jolson plays this character who's going up to heaven, and it's a black version of heaven, or it's a white version of a black version of heaven. So pork chops are growing on the trees, and there's watermelons everywhere.
And here is a man who has risen to stardom on the idea of Black culture. And you who have made a career of this, why? I mean, to further demean Black people.
It's probably shocking to people now to see this and think, well, how was that possibly acceptable? But this kind of representation seemed perfectly fine to the powers that be because they maintain the status quo in terms of America's race relations. If there had been a questioning of the nostalgia that people had for the Old South, or if you have Black characters who are asserting some kind of agency or even activism, God forbid, if you have characters, Black and white characters in some kind of intimate relationship, those were the kinds of things that were being censored at the time.
And my feeling is that many of the people at that point working in movies were aware of blackface during vaudeville and may have had some kind of nostalgia for it or felt that it was entertainment value in it.
So you get.
So I'm going to stop the movie there for the sake of time, but you are welcome to go ahead and watch the rest of it at a later date. So now we can move on to our next discussion question, which starts with, unfortunately, even though blackface is not nearly as common as it was back in the days of minstrelsy, unfortunately, cases of blackface and brownface, which is the term for doing the same thing but to make yourself look like a South Asian or South American person, this still does happen today, even if in a lesser extent. How can we educate people against this?
Hello, I'm comedian Hari Kundabolu, and I'm here to discuss the Washington Redskins. For the last couple of decades now, the NFL's Washington Football Club has been under fire for their team name, a team name that some people find blatantly racist. Meanwhile, team owner Dan Snyder has defended the Redskins name, claiming it's a way to honor Native Americans. Really? When is pointing out the color of a person's skin a way to honor them? Especially when it's not the color of their actual skin. Would you go up to Denzel Washington and say, "Wow, you have black skin"? Hey Denzel, you're a real Washington black skin. Get it? Some fans claim that the Redskins name can't be changed because it's part of their tradition. The Redskins tradition is only 81 years old. That's like one grandparent. One racist grandparent. Also, your tradition is weird. Your logo is a stand-in for somebody's ancestor. Imagine if I started a football team called the New York Your Dead Grandfather, and my logo was your dead grandfather's disembodied head. Also, 77 Native American tribes and organizations wrote a letter to every NFL player urging them to support a name change. But look, I get it. This is America and we're all about compromise here. I mean, how else do you explain Rhode Island? Do you really think that was the original plan? And look, a recent survey shows that 71% of Americans think the Redskins should keep their name. So here's my great Redskins compromise. You can keep the name Redskins if you agree to change the logo to a severely sunburned white person. So what do you think? Let me guess. Some of you think this is equally offensive. No. Equally offensive is changing the San Jose Sharks logo to a shark eating a white person. And honestly, those are only equally offensive if we lived in a society where white people were driven from their ancestral homes, routinely exploited, and forced into brutal poverty by sharks, and then played for a team owned by sharks. Then it would be equally offensive. Some of you might be thinking that that's still mean, but it's not nearly as mean as how we got the logo.
Hurry! Can we please stop?
No, Brian. Not until there's justice. You believe in justice, don't you?
I do, but this really hurts.
Yes, racism hurts everybody. Now, what I need from you good people of the internet is to make your own severely sunburned white person logos and tweet them to the Redskins with the hashtag #NewRedskinsLogo. From there, we'll post it on newredskinslogo.tumblr.com. You see, it doesn't matter how old your tradition is. If enough people tell you that it's hurting them, maybe you should reevaluate your choices.
Harry, I'm in so much pain.
Shut up, Brian. Hopefully, by the end of this campaign, we'll find a compromise that makes everybody happy.
Harry, please.
I will drink your tears. So start tweeting your submissions today.
All right, so that's a pretty funny video, but it is worth saying that since this video came out, in recent years, just in 2020, the Redskins football team did announce that they will change their name after years of backlash of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people coming forward and saying that this is offensive. So they finally did agree to change their name. But that being said, there are still a lot of teams out there that continue to have Indigenous names, and not even pro league teams, but also just high school sports teams, because it's still considered okay and appropriate. So keeping that in mind, why is language so important when it comes to things like team names, mascots, logos, and other depictions? We do have one more video, and then another question, and then we will move on.
Cultural appreciation is when you actually work with the people from the culture that you're taking something from.
I'm inspired by this, and I also want to contribute to this culture as well. The type of model high fashion brands use in their campaigns indicate who their target market is.
If you're very inspired by, say, Moroccan culture, put a North African model in your clothes.
Good example of somebody doing it right is Fenty. Bella Hadid came out in a yellow lingerie, but there was a headdress kind of reminiscent of a hijab. The fact that she used a Palestinian model reflects the lack of backlash.
There are already so many people doing whatever you want to do, and they will do it 10 times better than you can.
Big fashion brands can avoid having these types of backlash when they get people from the culture to consult.
I don't feel like there's actual need for another person that isn't part of my culture to now go and represent. Just let the people that are actually of the culture talk.
It'd be so easy for brands to give these people a platform and a voice and say, we really appreciate your artisanal skills, hire them to make the garments.
So if you've taken inspiration from a certain culture, make sure that everyone knows the story of where it came from, how it came about.
A small interview, just giving credit towards that, I think makes the whole difference. What I feel like makes people so angry when, you're not really acknowledging what its actual roots are.
How did you make this a space that is more about them as well? Because a culture doesn't exist without its people.
All right, so this last video was about showing cultural appreciation rather than appropriation. So our last question is, what are other ways that you can think of that we can respectfully show appreciation for another person or group's culture? So one thing we had already mentioned earlier is talking about buying from artists and artisans and small businesses who are from that culture, who are owned, run, and operated by people of that culture, rather than buying them from some knockoff big brand stores or businesses. So what are maybe some other ways that we can think of as well? More ideas of what cultural appreciation can look like. It's not limited to these, of course, but this could be a good start. So first off, giving credit to and acknowledging someone's culture. At the very least, if you are buying something or using something or sharing something, by from the very beginning giving credit to the culture or the person that it came from. As well as we were talking about buying cultural clothes, artifacts, and media from people of that culture rather than knockoffs. So you can support racialized artists, filmmakers, performers, fashion designers, content creators, and much more. And then, of course, educate yourself about the culture you are interested in and its past and present history of oppression. Don't just take something without thinking about it. Really reflect and do your research and learn. You can also give back through donations, volunteering, or other means. That is always a great way to show your support and to contribute to causes that you care about. And perhaps most importantly, if someone tells you that they're offended or uncomfortable with the way you are expressing your appreciation for their culture, then actually listen to them. Don't get defensive. Don't brush them off or ignore them. Listen to what they have to say. And here we have some more resources for further learning. If you're interested in learning even more, we have a couple videos here as well as some online websites that you can look into. And as always, Google is your friend. You can do your own research as well. And there are lots of other books and movies out there. So that concludes this webinar session. Thank you all so much for coming today and for listening and for sharing your own opinions and opening your minds as always.